And we're continuing with the 8th chapter of The Stolen Lake by Joan Aiken. They spent the night on a rock ledge above the Great Hollow. Dylan kindled a fire to keep off jaguars and mountain lions, which it successfully did. The fire was of small use for cooking, since they were so high up here that water boiled at a very low temperature. But they toasted plantains on sticks and ate hunks of barley bread. Then, wrapped in ruanas and vicuna fleeces, they lay down to a cold and uneasy night's rest, with the burrows tethered in a ring around them for added protection. "What about aurochs?" Dido said to Mr. Multiple. "Dylan says they all go to roost at night. They have weak vision, and they don't like dark or cloudy weather. At least we shan't have to worry about them till sunup." But Dido could not easily dismiss the thought of the horrible creatures. They flapped and shrieked through her dreams. Mr. Holystone, too, seemed troubled by nightmares. He tossed and moaned and cried out words in some foreign tongue. Dido remembered that he had said he was found as a baby on the shores of Lake Arianrhod. She wondered if the knowledge that he was so close to his birthplace had somehow penetrated his slumbers. Long before dawn, Dylan was up and feeding the burros. "I go now, sirs. I'm leaving you here," he announced briefly. "Arianrhod, you see below, you keeping south, sun behind you." He gestured along the basin between the steeply angled sides of Calabi and Catalonde. "You soon coming to pass of Nimue. Lioness on ahead. You finding stable of Caridog and Guardian down below. Sul's temple up above on mountain. You showing permit to Caridog, he let you through pass." Windward and Multiple tried to persuade Dylan to accompany them farther, but he shook his head emphatically. "Arianrhod, no good place, sirs. Benigni. I coming no farther. I going now. Sararimi." "But what about the aurochs, man, on the way back? How the deuce will you get through safely on your own? Keeping them off?" "No fear," he gestured with his crossbow. "I riding best fast burro. Salvarete. Goodbye, sirs." Lieutenant Windward paid his fee, which he demanded in cash. Dylan kicked his mount into a rapid trot and departed, waving his sombrero, but without ever looking back. The rest of the party lost no time in setting off in the opposite direction. A narrow track, dug out of the steeply sloping mountainside, led down in zigzags to the level of the lake basin, and then along beside what had presumably been the shore of the lake when it was full of water. As they scrambled down the zigzags, the sun mounted behind Catalonde, which was plainly an active volcano. Black clouds of smoke issued from its cup-shaped summit, throwing wild shadows over the white mist, which still filled the lake bed. However, just as the party reached the narrow level track that skirted the lake, all this mist rose up and hung in the sky overhead, so that the travelers were able to see the dry, sandy, and stony area, which was what King Mabon had left his neighbor, Queen Ginevra, when he removed her lake. "Must have been a right job taking it," said Dido. "Hey, Mr. Windward, why don't us ride along the bed of the lake instead of this narrow track? Then we can all bunch together in case of aurochs." Windward thought this a good suggestion, and the burros were urged down onto the lake bed. No aurochs, however, appeared today, presumably because of the heavy cloud overhead, which now obscured the sun. A great many dried fish bones were scattered on the sand, evidently. When the water had been removed, a number of mountain predators had been furnished with an unexpected fish dinner. "This looks like gold-bearing soil to me," said Mr. Multiple. "There's gold mines in Wales where I used to stay with my uncle. If the ground looked like this, I dare say we could all make our fortunes if we sieved up a bit of this sand." "Best not touch it," warned Windward. "Don't forget, Arianrhod was a sacred lake. The Queen would have our guts for garters, likely, if you began digging up the bed." Mr. Multiple's face assumed an obstinate expression. He made no answer, but continued to keep a careful eye on the ground as he rode along. Presently he let out an exclamation. "Now what?" demanded Windward. "For heaven's sake, man, keep up a better pace. We shan't reach the frontier by nightfall at this rate." But Mr. Multiple, tumbling impetuously off his burro, had scooped something off the ground, which he now triumphantly exhibited. "What do you say to that, then? A diamond as big as a pullet's egg, and my name's not Frank Multiple." Are you certain? Said the lieutenant skeptically. It looks to me like an earthy pebble. It's no pebble, sir. It's a diamond. See here, and he scraped it with his thumbnail. My granddad was a goldsmith. I could not mistake. Hey, there's dozens of 'em. Let us stop at half an hour, and we're all rich as Croesus. Windward was resolute, however, that they must press on, so Mr. Multiple discontentedly climbed back onto the saddle, muttering privately to Noah Gusset that it was a hen shame. He stared hard at the ground as they rode along, every now and then leaping down to grab a stone, remounting, and kicking his donkey into a fast trot to overtake the others again. Dido could not help being somewhat infected by his enthusiasm. She too began to study the ground as she rode, and so chanced to perceive what seemed to be a rusty metal cross, half buried in a shallow sandy depression. A wink of red at its extremity had caught her eye. Here, hold hard a minute, Mr. Windward, she said. Maybe this thing's somewhat worth taking along. Might be valuable. Sliding to the ground, she knelt and tugged at the cross-shaped object. To her surprise, the buried end was far longer than it had appeared, and quite deeply embedded in the ground. She had a hard struggle to pull it out. Do pray make haste, Miss Twite, said Windward impatiently. We cannot be forever stopping for trifles. This ain't no trifle. Blimey, it's a sword, cried Dido in triumph, and I reckon it's worth a packet too. Look at all them coloured sparkles in the handle. Yes, well, that's as may be, but the blade's all rusty. I wish you will not be lumbering up with such useless articles. In any case, it undoubtedly belongs to the Queen. Well, then we better hand it to that there, what's his name? The Guardian. And he can send it back to her, said Dido reasonably. It won't hurt poor old Mr. Holy to have it by him. And she laid it in the litter and hopped back onto her burro. No further incidents occurred to fidget Mr. Windward during the ride along the dried-up lake bed. Fortunately, the low cloud prevented any attacks by aurochs, but the atmosphere was very oppressive, sultry and heavy. The burros slipped and stumbled on the shingly, powdery sand. I guess even the ground is hot hereabouts, said Dido, feeling it with her hand when they stopped for a drink. None of them felt hungry. It may well be, said Mr. Multiple. After all, we're getting uncommonly close to that big volcano. Look, you can see lava running down it like toffee. Supposing that big rock toppled off when we were passing by. I reckon it's been there for a good few 1,000 years, said Lieutenant Windward. This is a right spooky place. I ain't surprised Dylan didn't want to come here, Dido said. Deep among the four surrounding mountains, twin-headed Araby, dome-shaped Damiac, cloud-girt Calabi, and smoke-belching Catalonde, with a huge stone balanced on its summit, the travelers felt as if they were at the bottom of a well, with black, steeply shelving slopes rising all around them. There were very few birds to be seen here, and no animals at all. The only sound that broke the silence was an occasional rumbling mutter from Mount Catalonde ahead of them. I'll be glad when we're past that one, thought Dido. She noticed that when Catalonde rumbled, Mr. Holystone stirred restlessly in his litter as if he could hear the sound in his dreams. In mid-afternoon, some 3/4 of the way along the basin, they reached a point from which the far end was visible. They could see the narrow pass which led out and southward toward Lyonesse. You can see why the water didn't flow out when the Queen first had the lake put here, said Mr. Multiple. It's been dammed. Well, she wouldn't want it to trickle away, having brought it so far. I suppose they brought it down on water skins, on burros. Or llamas, said Dido. Mount Catalonde gave a loud snort, and Mr. Holystone cried out sharply, stirring and rolling over on his side. His hand, gripping about, found the handle of the rusty sword that Dido had unearthed and clasped it. He murmured some brief remark and opened his eyes. Hey, Mr. Windward! Dido called to the lieutenant, who was on ahead. Mr. Holystone said something. He's a-stirring. I believe he's a mite better. Maybe if we gave him a drink. Windward sighed, turned his burro, and came back. Did he really speak? It's not a Banbury story. But he, too, sounded hopeful. He, like everybody else, greatly respected Mr. Holystone's judgment. In the present circumstances, without the captain, and now their numbers reduced by the loss of Plum, The steward's restoration to health and consciousness would be a piece of great good fortune. What did he say? Sounded like halibut. Oh, fiddle-dee-dee, Miss Twite. It did not. No, it did. Truly, listen. Caliburn, muttered Mr. Holystone indistinctly, and then louder with more assurance. Caliburn. Noah Gusset had already halted the pair of burros that carried the litter slung between them, and was taking out his leather water bottle. Now Dido and Mr. Multiple assisted the sick man to sit up. He looked around him wonderingly at the black snow-streaked mountains, slopes, and the sandy lake bed, at their concerned faces watching him, and lastly at the sword in his hand. For the third time, in a tone of joy and recognition, he repeated the word, Caliburn! My sword, come back to my hand. Mr. Holystone! Cried Dido in rapture. Are you feeling more the thing now? His eyes rested on her with an expression of perplexity. I know this place, he said. I know the sword, I know myself, but who are you? Who are these? Glancing again at Windward, Noah, and Multiple. Why, we're your friends, Mr. Holy. Don't you recognize us? Dido was terribly startled and grieved. No, my child, but I can see that you are all good people. Your faces are trustworthy. Trustworthy? Said Lieutenant Windward rather shortly. So I should hope. If you knew how far we had hauled you up these god-forsaken mountains. Come now, do you not remember us? I'm Lieutenant Windward, First Lieutenant of His Majesty's sloop Thrush, and this is Mr. Midshipman Multiple. This is Miss Twite. Don't you remember all those times I helped you polish the captain's teaspoons, Mr. Holy? It was quite plain that he did not. Noah Gusset sensibly suggested, He may be weak and wambly yet. Why don't us give him a drop of something hot? Since it was impossible to boil water, they gave the recovering man a drink of aguardiente and some of the cassava bread and baked turtle's eggs, which none of them had fancied for their midday meal. The patient ate slowly and could not take much, but the food visibly did him good. When he had finished, he stood up, unassisted by slow and careful stages, stretched and staggered, but kept his balance, leaning on the sword, which he had held tightly clasped in his hand since awakening. Then, frowning in perplexity, he said, You brought me here on the litter, but then where had I been before? He articulated his words very slowly, as if translating from another language in his mind. Brought you here? Why, from the Thrush, of course, Windward repeated. You're the captain's steward. Don't you remember anything? Holystone shook his head. I remember battles. The alliance against us, King Mark, King Lot, King Anguish, and my nephew, Mordred, and then I was wounded. Here, he raised an uncertain hand to the back of his head. I gave Caliburn to Bedivere to throw in the lake. His hand lovingly caressed the hilt of the sword. He glanced down and said, The blade is rusty, but a rub in the sand will soon mend that. Lieutenant Windward exclaimed impatiently, Come, my man. What the deuce ails you? This is moonshine. Battles, alliances? Ah, well, I reckon you are all toddy-headed yet. We had best be on our way. Make haste, the rest of you. Pack up those things. There's no sense in lingering here. At any moment the clouds may lift and aurochs be upon us, he added privately to Mr. Multiple. Let us hope there will be some surgeon or physician at King Mabon's court who can set the poor fellow's wits to rights. Otherwise he won't be much use to us. Bustle about now, Miss Twite. Holystone, however, flatly refused to get back into the litter. He said that he was well enough to ride if they did not go too fast. While he and the lieutenant were arguing about this, Dido felt something rub against her leg. Murder! She cried, her mind on Aurochs, and then, looking down, she added in amazement, Oh no, if it ain't another of them cats! Then, inspired by a hopeful notion, she grabbed the cat and, carrying it to Mr. Holystone, said, See who's here, Mr. Holy. It's the spit image of Dora. Your cat, Eldorado? Dora, he muttered doubtfully, rubbing his brow. One of the cats of Eldorado? That's the ticket, Mr. Holy. You'll remember soon enough, and this one's got a message, I'll be bound. Yes, it has. Another page from that dictionary. Tim Toldrum, said the name on the leather disc, and the leaf of paper informed them. To coax, to wheedle, to flatter, to humor, a low word. Under the printed words, the same desperate little hand had written in dark brown ink, For pity's sake, help me. I am suffocating in the dark. Ellen. Ellen, said Mr. Holystone hoarsely. Ellen! A silence fell around him, as if he were standing on an island. Lieutenant Windward cleared his throat and said, Anne, we really must. Ellen, said Holystone. In the dark. Where? We must find her. How can we find her? The cat mewed insistently at his feet. Why, exclaimed Dido, don't you see it's dead simple? Moggy here will lead us to her, won't you, puss? I'm a prisoner on Erebee, the second note said. That's Erebee. That big black hill up there on the left. We haven't time, Lieutenant Windward began. Oh, come on, Mr. Windward. The poor girl's shut up. We've got to rescue her, don't we? Look, the cat started already. The black flanks of Erebee were broken, stony and drear, as if they had been gashed and chipped and scraped raw by some great volcanic explosion. Here and there, a bunch of rough itchu grass thrust out of a crack. There was no other vegetation, but the slope was not hard to climb. Leaving the burrows hobbled on the lake bed, the party began scrambling up and around and in among the ragged and tumbled boulders, following the cat, who trotted ahead purposely, tail in the air, every now and then stopping to glance around as if perplexed by the slowness of their progress. The wind, which had been rising all day, howled lugubriously, and a few pellets of hail dashed in their faces. Best get a move on there, puss, called Dido, who, being light and agile, was ahead of the rest. We're all liable to be blown to blazes if we don't find this poor perisher soon. Then she stopped, short in dismay, for after threading its way up a narrow gully, the cat jumped lightly up to the top of a massive boulder, leaning against a rock face, and then, next instant, slipped through a crevice behind the boulder and vanished. The blessed cat went in behind that there rock, Dido said to Mr. Holystone, who, surprisingly, in spite of his recent disability, was the first of her companions to come up with her. Now what's to do? Although he was so changed and queer, she had at once fallen back into the habit of depending on his advice in difficulties. He stood frowning, leaning on the sword, staring at the rock as if trying to recall something. Noah Gusset, arriving next, surveyed the rock and said dubiously, Reckon someone's in behind there, Miss Dido. Us'll never shift that. 'Tis nigh as big as a house. The cat has led us on a fool's errand, irritably exclaimed Lieutenant Windward, arriving at this moment. Wait, though, said Mr. Multiple, who was close behind him. I've a notion. Bringing out a ship's whistle, which he carried on a string round his neck, he blew a long, piercing blast. The sound was almost swamped by a great gust of wind that flung more hail in their faces, but not quite, and it had two unexpected results. From somewhere up above them, on the rock face, two huge mountain owls came flapping down, and from inside the rock a faint voice called, Help! There, what did I say? Shouted Dido triumphantly. Somebody is shut up back of that rock. Hey! Murder! Lay off me, you nasty brutes! For the two owls, yellow eyes blazing, wings beating like flails, had swooped at the rescue party and were furiously attacking them. Devil take the fiends! Watch out for their eyes! Yelled Windward, who was already bleeding from a savage peck on the cheekbone. Oh, get away, curse you! Slashing at one of the birds with his cutlass. They were as big as swans and quite as fierce. Maybe that's their nest in behind, gasped Dido, clasping her hands over her face to protect it, as one of the owls alighted on her head, digging razor-sharp claws into her scalp. Krupus! It's nigh pulling my head off! The next moment she had almost had her breath knocked out as the body collided violently against hers. A cruel grip of the talons on her head suddenly slackened. She shook her head, abruptly free of the owl's weight, and looked around her, rubbing drops of blood from her eyes. That is done for one of them, said Mr. Holystone. He was surveying the blade of his sword, which now seemed darker than from mere rust. The owl that had been on Dido's head flapped away down the gully, bleeding and shedding feathers. It perched on a rock, then slowly toppled off it and was lost to view among the boulders on the ground. Its companions, screeching and hooting mournfully, circled around once or twice, then planed away into the distance and did not reappear. Mr. Holystone hardly glanced at the vanquished owl. He had gone back to studying the surface of the rock that confronted him. Now, with a soft exclamation of satisfaction, he found what he was looking for, a small slit in the surface of the stone. A little lichen grew over it, which he rubbed away with his thumb. Looks like a keyhole, Dido said, and was immediately reminded of the great cumbrous quay in Bath, shaped like swans, or of the great cumbrous quays in Bath, shaped like swans or dragons with keyholes to match. But where's the key? Mr. Holystone, without answering her question, inserted the tip of his sword into the rock and thrust inward strongly, so that the weapon, by slow degrees, vanished up to the hilt. All very well, muttered Windward. But now what? Help! The faint voice called from inside the cave. We're here! We're trying to help you, Dido called. Mr. Holystone laid both hands on the hilt of the sword. His forehead bulged, his veins swelled, beads of sweat rolled down his cheeks and into his beard. His wrists and forearms knotted with exertion. He began to twist the hilt. He'll break that sword, sure as a gun, grunted Windward. No one else said anything. The hail was rattling like grape shot, but nobody heeded it. All their attention was focused on those two straining hands. Suddenly there came a sharp crack, like the sound of a sail flapping in a high wind, and a V-shaped crevice appeared in the center of the rock barrier, as its two halves gradually tilted sideways away from each other. Mr. Holystone stepped back, slowly withdrawing the sword from the widening crack. He was gasping, his chest heaved with effort, but otherwise it was hard to believe that this was the man who, day after day, had lain unconscious without speech or movement. He glanced at his companions, his eyes lit on Dido. You are small. You can climb through the gap, he said curtly. Without a word, Dido did as she was directed, ignoring Windward's peevish interjection of, Wait a moment now! How do we know what's in there? Dido lowered herself cautiously through the narrow aperture. Anybody at home? She inquired. It was pitch dark inside, but she was heartened and encouraged by the feeling of the cat vigorously rubbing against her leg. The air was terribly scanty, stale, and bad. She found it only just possible to breathe. Hey! She gulped, putting her head back through the crack. Fetch up some of those roomy flowers, can you? Aye, aye, answered multiple. And she heard his feet thudding off down the gully. Then came a loud cry of amazement or fright. Dido ignored that. Her eyes were becoming accustomed to the dim light. She could see a small figure huddled in the corner of the cave. Hello, she said softly. Who's that? Can you speak? Are you Ellen? Yes, Ellen, came the faint answer. Air, please, air. Don't you fret. Air's a-comin'. Rest easy. Groping her way across the cave, Dido felt about and found a thin hand which she clasped comfortingly. It seemed very small, not even as large as her own. In 5 minutes or less, Mr. Multiple was back with an armful of roomy lilies, which he thrust through the gap. Outside, beyond the rock, Dido could hear him excitedly telling the others some piece of news which evoked gasps of amazement and disbelief from Windward and Noah. Go look for yourselves, said Mr. Multiple. Dido, meanwhile, held the bundle of flowers close to the prisoner's face. There, she whispered. Breathe deep now. That'll set you right in a brace of shakes. The prisoner breathed, gulped, and coughed. Cough, thought Dido, a convulsion of the lungs. She felt around on the floor of the cave and discovered a small, thick book. And we'll pause there.